What we're going to be talking about today is just Craft and Import Beer 101, a very basic look at beer. Now, if you work in the beverage industry, one of the things that we all understand is that you know something about beer. However, a lot of us don't know more than very basic information about beer. We know that we like it. We know that it brings joy. We know that it tastes good. We know that it has things like water in it. I think most people would say, well, it's an alcoholic beverage. It's fermented. It has water. It has malt. That's it. Barley. Hops. They've heard these words, but they don't really understand how they interact. And so what we need to do is look a little bit more at these ingredients and what they do, and then what they do for beer, and then you can answer some questions that you may get asked. Because what happens is we get questions about these things that we love, and if you're selling beer, or you're informing people about beer, or you're distributing beer, one of the things you have to do is understand that you're going to be asked a lot of questions. And the more you know, the more knowledge you have about the subject, the better you can serve your customers. The better you can say to people, well, you're asking me this question, and I can answer it, and I can also lead you in the right direction. And then they trust you a little bit more, and by trusting you a lot more than they did before, then you'll be able to sell them on things that they need and that you're able to provide. And so it's the same thing in any subject that we talk about. If the more we know, the better served we are to serve others. So here, let's look at a few things about beer. Well, what is beer? Well, beer is a process. It's a very old process of converting sugared water into fermented liquid. As long as society's been around, people have fermented liquids. The oldest recipes ever found, some of the oldest recipes ever found have been beer recipes. And so we understand that these recipes have been around as long as society's been around. As long as people have been making tools, have been eating out of pots and pans, have been speaking language or writing things down, they have been brewing beer. And so if it is that important throughout human history, we need to understand that it's pretty important for us to understand a little bit about it. Beer is also a necessity in ancient times. Water quality throughout human history, really up until like the 20th century in first world countries, water quality has been very poor. And still, if you go overseas into third world countries, developing nations, they still have very poor water quality. Well, the fermenting of the water actually takes out some of the impurities, and it makes it actually healthier to drink. And so that's one of the things that people have known throughout history, is they brewed beer because it was healthier and a better thing for them to drink than the poor water quality that they had. When the Pilgrims were coming over to the New World, one of the reasons they landed in Plymouth Rock, according to legend, is because they were running out of beer. And they understood on their ship that if they ran out of beer, people would start to get sick because they would be drinking probably the water that they had that was not as good for you. And they would be getting sick, and then people might die. And so they landed a little bit earlier than they wanted to. It is something that's been around for years with social and medical contributions and part of American tradition. The Puritans in New England, what they did was they actually had an allotment that everyone that lived there had of beer. It was part of the most religious society we've ever had in the United States of America, actually found that beer was one of the things that contributed to a better society and brought people together. So, if that's what beer is, what's in a beer? Well, some of the things I mentioned that people have heard of before. Barley, that's the body and the soul of the beer. The yeast, well, we would say that's the life of the beer. It's actually a living organism that is in your beer. The hops, they're the spice of the beer. That's the thing that gives it that flavor that makes, when you're younger, you think, oh, it's that thing that you have to get past the first time you ever have a beer. And then the waters, the integrity and purity of beer. And one thing that is also in some beer is adjuncts. These are extra additives. They're grains like rice or corn, and sometimes they're fruit or spices. Fruit and spices have been in beer for as long as we've been making beer. So the barley, what is the barley? It's the body and the soul. The barley malt gives the beer that malty sweet flavor. You know, whenever you taste a beer, and if it's a little bit sweet, a lot of your European beers, your Hefeweizens, your stouts, a lot of them are a little bit sweeter and maltier. Well, that's what gives it that flavor. It's the natural enzymes that convert the starch to sugar, which is needed for fermentation. So without barley malt, you're not going to be able to have beer, is basically what that says. And also, it gives it that color. It's what makes some beer, darker than others or a little bit richer looking than others. And it gives it that foamy head. Again, when you think of Guinness, when you think of your Hefeweizens, you think of the barley. You think of that malt. And a variety of barley malts help determine the color, the texture, and the flavor of beer. Okay, so barley's one thing. What about the yeast? That's the life of the beer. The yeast is a catalyst of change. It's what actually is the fermenting agent. It's a one-cell microorganism, and it produces carbon dioxide and alcohol. So it basically eats what's in the beer. It eats that barley, and it produces carbon dioxide and alcohol. And there are two types of yeast that are used to produce beer. And this is where all beer falls under one of two categories, except for some of your specialties. Ales, which use a top fermenting yeast, and lagers, which is a bottom fermenting yeast. And so basically everything falls underneath those. When you think of pilsners, when you think of Hefeweizens, when you think of stouts, when you think of everything under the sun, they're either ales or lagers. And there are literally thousands of brewer's yeast that create a variety of styles. Okay, hops. This is that spice. Hop flowers are used to stabilize the beer. They have a lot of antiseptic qualities, which, again, this is some of the stuff that makes it, that purifies the beer. The hop aroma, the fruity, flavorful, flowery characteristics, the bitterness. It balances that malty sweetness. And so a lot of the beers, what you see nowadays, or a lot of the microbrews, are kind of pushing the bitterness a little bit farther than most people probably have in the past. It stabilizes the foam and enhances the head properties. And there are two primary types of hops. There's the aroma hops, which usually in a lot of beers are added a little bit later in the process, and the bitter hops, which are what are added earlier, and that's what makes you go with beer. Hops are grown around the world and between the 35th and 55th degrees of latitude and harvested in the fall. Just like tobacco for cigars, for cigarettes, is harvested in certain places, peanuts are harvested in certain places, so are hops. And so you can't really grow hops in different places, even though people try. Water is the integrity and the purity. Water makes up 92% of beer. It is basically what it is. Through filtration or boiling, the impurities, the aromas, and the flavor differences can be mitigated. And so it's very important that people use the same style of water. It's why people will tell you that if they're in Ireland, they will say that the Guinness tastes different in Ireland than it does in America, because some of the Guinness, the water, is what's different there versus here. Water styles can affect flavor. Hard water helps crisp and cleanliness, and soft water adds smoothness to your beer. Adjuncts, these are the wild cards. These things are added to change the flavor, character, and profile of beer. They're used to supplement the main starch source to provide for better foam retention, color, aroma. A lot of people use adjuncts basically to make sure that every single beer tastes exactly the same. That's why with things like Budweiser, the beer always tastes the same no matter what Budweiser you're drinking, where with some of the microbrews, it's a little bit different. Corn, rice, wheat, oats, or rye are also involved. Specialty ingredients. There are sweet things like maple or honey, some of your fall specialty beers. Fruits, raspberry, cherry, or cranberry. Your lambics, your framboise fall under that category. And then spices like cinnamon, coriander, or clove. And what is a lager? Let's just look at a couple of basic things about a lager. A lager means to store. It's bottom fermenting yeast, and the fermenting at lower temperatures, 50 degrees. They are lagered close to freezing for several weeks, and they're characterized by a few things. They're crisp tasting, they're lighter bodied, and less fruity aroma. They have a rounded, smooth flavor. And over the last 150 years or so, they have become the predominant beers that we drink. In America, most people drink lagers. What is the other type? And here you can just look at that. That is an example of pilsners, strong lagers, malt liquors, Oktoberfests. All of these fall under the lager style. And then the other style is the ale. And I'm going to kind of end after we talk a little bit about ales. Ale is synonymous for beer. It's a top fermenting process of, you ferment the yeast on the top, and you ferment it at a higher temperature for a shorter amount of time. It ferments less fully and less discriminately. So your ales can be different. There's a lot more variety with ales from the way it's fermented. They're characterized by more fruity flavors, aromas, and with that malty, full-bodied flavor. And then before 1800s, basically every single beer was an ale. And let's just look at a couple seconds. This is the styles of ale. As you can see, there are many more. American ales, cream ales, imperial ales, Indian ales, stouts, porters, wheat beers. You name it, if it's not one of the basics, it's probably an ale. And so what I want to do right now is just ask for any questions before we move on to the next subject.